Today, we are going to explore how knowing your mind can make you a better leader.
Before we dive in, Dan, could you please explain our audiences in very simple terms what neuroscience-based leadership actually means?
Brain-based leadership or neuroscience-based leadership is working with your brain instead of against your brain to really maximize your decision-making, your behavior, your creativity.
Dan, we would also want to know that when a leader is under pressure, right?
Yeah.
What really happens in the brain?
Someone angers me. It's easier and quicker for my brain to lash out at them and yell and maybe attack them than it is to stop and maybe think about my behavior, think about their perspective versus mine.
Are there some tips that leaders can adopt and, they can expect a change or a better outcome? Welcome to The Better Effect, a podcast hosted by the Center for Behavioral Insights and powered by Fortune Institute of International Business. I am Dr. Tavleen.
And I'm Dr. Sahiba Sahani.
And we together lead the Center for Behavioral Insights. Today, we are going to explore how knowing your mind can make you a better leader.
Joining us today is a very special guest, someone who's a neuroscientist, a TEDx speaker, and Chief Scientific Officer at the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership, Dr. Dan Radecki. Welcome to The Better Effect.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
Likewise. So before we dive in, Dan, could you please explain our audiences in very simple terms what neuroscience-based leadership actually means?
Yeah, if you think about it, it's really about understanding your brain limitations, your brain strengths. Our brain is a wonderful machine that we're learning more about every day. It's really the last frontier in medicine. And we're finding out how resilient it really is. And so really what we try to think about when we talk about brain-based leadership or neuroscience-based leadership is working with your brain. I mean, it sounds simple, but working with your brain instead of against your brain to really maximize your decision-making, your behavior, your creativity. Ultimately, I think it's about self-awareness so you can build resilience, not just in your professional life, but in your personal life as well.
Dan, we would also want to know that when a leader is under pressure, right?
Yeah.
What really happens in the brain and which areas of the brain are most active when a leader is under pressure?
When we're under pressure, which we all are, one of the culprits of, when I said limitations of our brain, one of the culprits is stress. Okay, so when we're under pressure, as we can all relate to, we can become a bit frazzled. If we get too much, it's called burnout, right? What we're finding in neuroscience and in medicine in general is that chronic stress can really impact our brain in ways we never knew before. We understand what chronic stress does to our immune system, to our cardiovascular system, but we're starting to understand what it does to our brain. And the short story is really, we think chronic stress, the inability to manage our stress over a long period of time leads to things like it contributes to cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and we're thinking it also has contributions to things like cancer. It's really profound to be able to manage that pressure that you talk about and the stress. When we're under pressure, we tend to use a very old part of our brain, the part of our brain you probably heard of the fight or flight mode, right? That sympathetic nervous system, that part of our brain we share with most species, which is basically used for survival, fight or flight, threat, right? And so when we're under pressure, when we have a lot of stress, that's what we go to. And unfortunately, if you see someone who's in burnout or under pressure, you see their behavior radically change. They're not able to think clearly or be creative or stop and take a different perspective of a situation. It's more about getting into that, we call it the old brain, that fight or flight mode, where threat dominates and the avoidance of threat, the avoidance of punishment takes over. And in that situation, we really don't have great access to our higher brain, that part of our brain that makes us uniquely human. So it's difficult to get the most out of our people when we are in that pressure or fight or flight mode.
We've also observed that in such situations, it is easier to make emotional decisions rather than rational decisions, even despite knowing that the other way around is better. So, why do you think this happens? Why do we shift to this default mode?
There's been a lot of research around that. And it's interesting because in making decisions and reacting emotionally, one, it actually feels better. Okay, because of the way our brain is wired, we've got this old brain that I mentioned, that's that fight or flight. It's very strong, very quick to react. It's very efficient. So all other things being equal, if someone angers me, it's easier and quicker for my brain to lash out at them and yell and maybe attack them than it is to stop and maybe think about my behavior, think about their perspective versus mine, and come to a rational decision. Those emotional decisions, even though we know that a lot of the times they're not the best route, we fall prey to them and we tend to just become emotional, overly emotional with our behavior. And again, that's sort of an indication that we're operating from that lower brain, and that happens a lot when we're in a stress state, particularly when we're in burnout.
Dan, since you're talking about what happens when a leader is under pressure and has those difficult times and not able to make those very rational decisions, are there some tips that leaders can adopt and they can expect a change or a better outcome? Are there any such tips? Because we've spoken about the problems, what happens, burnout, stress. So what should a leader do?
We do a lot of interventions and behavioral changes, and there's ways to manage it from sort of a behavioral standpoint. There's ways to do it with cognitive shifting in terms of how you see things. I think probably one of the most effective ways that we found in doing this for 16 years now is to have people become self-aware of what is driving their stress response. In other words, the way we typically do it is we refer to psychological safety. What is driving your brain's need for psychological safety? Based on the research, there's a short list of what we call domains to drive people's psychological safety. And if your brain has them, you feel safe. You don't feel that stress. If your brain is lacking them or craving them, then it causes a psychologically unsafe space, and you will be driven by your emotions. So what we typically do is we work through that model and get people awareness around which one of these domains, we call it the safety model, which one of those domains are most important for their brain, and that self-awareness about it. And then once they have that self-awareness, they are able to typically take a step back and say, oh, okay, I am seeing this situation from my own lens, my own bias, if you will. I'm going to take a step back and understand that that's my brain. It's my brain reacting. We have the saying, it's not you, it's your brain, right? It's not that so-and-so is being a difficult person. Their brain really needs a sense of certainty in life. They need the details. They need to know that there's no change because that's threatening to them. So when they have that self-awareness, then they can approach situations a little differently with a more of an open mind. So it really is about that self-awareness of your drivers for psychological safety and stress.
Dan, you've repeatedly used the term psychological safety. A lot of our audience is students who might not understand the term psychological safety. So do you mind decoding psychological safety for them?
Sure. We live in this world where physical safety, there's a premium on ensuring physical safety. If you work in any organization, environmental health safety, probably OSHA standards, where if you're walking down a hallway and you see an orange cone, you probably know what that means, right? It's wet, it's slippery. We take great care in ensuring that people are physically safe. What we're starting to do is realize how important it is to also ensure people are psychologically safe. Because in many cases, that psychological safety, if it's not present, it can do more damage than that physical safety. And I'll give you an example. Some of the research that the Gallup Foundation has done in asking the question, what motivates people at work, right? And what is the most problematic issues we see in organizations these days? And it's not the physical things. The motivating factors aren't the money or the corner office. It's, do I have a close relationship with my colleagues? Do I trust them? Am I treated fairly? Am I micromanaged? Those types of things that speak to the psychological safety. So there's a big push now to understand what psychological safety is and how to manage it, how to build it. It's a very big growing field definitely in the United States and Europe. And the way we typically define psychological safety is from a neuroscience standpoint. We use those domains I talked about earlier, the domains that from the research, the key piece is to feel psychologically safe. So security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, and trust. From the research, these are sort of five, I call them low-hanging fruits that are important for all of our brains. We all need a sense of security and autonomy. Which one of these are most important for your brain? And that gives you some insight in what's driving your behaviors. So for us, psychological safety is really the state where all five of those domains are adequately met for your brain so that you can feel that you're safe in your environment. You can feel that you can be trusted within your team, and you can feel a sense of not just vulnerability, but true engagement. And that's what we see psychological safety is. Some people liken it to emotional intelligence within a team.
So, Dan, are you trying to say that leaders who feel psychologically safe are better decision makers?
Yes, we're actually seeing that. It's akin to, a leader who's emotionally intelligent. Psychological safety is sort of the next step of that. You're emotionally intelligent, but then you can translate that to your team. You can ensure that I understand how I'm feeling. I understand what's driving me. I can challenge my perspectives and biases, but I can also see other people's perspectives, even if I don't agree with them. And I can manage them the way their brain needs to be managed. It's high level. It's not intuitive for most people. But yes, what we're seeing and the reports we get from the people we're working with in the teams is that once this culture shifts to one of putting a priority on psychological safety, and the leaders buy into this, you have a much higher performing team. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you're familiar with some of Amy Edmondson's work. She's a pioneer in the field of psychological safety at Harvard, and she and Google did some compelling research they published. Google, they're great with analytics and measuring things. And so a few years ago, they wanted to know what was the secret recipe for their high-performing teams at Google? What was it about these teams? So they analyzed a few hundred teams, and what they found out was surprising. They thought, well, the best performing teams probably have the most experienced leaders, the most educated, that type of thing. And what they found out was the number one factor determining high-performing teams was how psychologically safe the team was. And that was surprising because that wasn't expected. Since that time, the field has really exploded in trying to understand this whole idea of psychological safety and build it.
Well, in fact, Dan, psychological safety has been always a very crucial success factor when it comes to leadership, but it gained more importance post the COVID pandemic that we had.
Yes.
So that brings me to another next question, Dan. So can you share some real world examples with us where, it could be from research or it could be from your own experience where knowing your brain actually changed the outcome?
I sort of had a feet in both worlds. I'm, working at the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership and doing some of this work, but I've also spent a lot of time as a leader in the corporate world and biotech. And I'm currently in that world now. And so I see both sides of it. What drew me to this was this disconnect between what we know about the brain and the best way to manage and deal with those emotions and things like you say, and what's actually done, even at the highest level. So I led a team a few years ago that I brought this self-awareness in, this psychological safety training. And it was interesting because as humans, language is very important. So we established the language, and so for the example I think of is we were in a big team meeting, and it was a very stressful meeting. We were dealing with the FDA regulators in the US about a new drug we were going to get approved. And it was an all-day meeting, and we really needed the input of the entire team. We needed creativity. And this team, because I took them through this training and they understood the importance of psychological safety and taking people's perspectives, there was a point where things got heated. And there was a lot of discussion going on, a lot of debates. One person stood up who was very critical for us. They were a regulatory person. They stood up in the room and they said, my sense of fairness is being challenged right now. Okay, now that sounds a little silly, but what it did to us in the room is knowing how important the sense of fairness is to the brain. We knew this person was starting to feel unsafe, okay? And they were starting to feel a sense of stress and frustration. And that meant they weren't going to be able to really use to access that higher brain for creativity and moments of insight that we needed. So we all stepped back and said, okay, we are going to give this person the floor and let them speak and let them have their point put out there. That really worked well. Now, I think about what would have happened in other situations if we didn't have this knowledge and training, which typically, you're in a heated conversation like that, and someone feels like they're not being heard and trying to get a word in and they can't. They stand up and they start yelling. Okay, they start attacking. They start becoming emotional. And what happens then? The people in the room, they react emotionally as well. Their stress, fight, or flight gets triggered. And you have this sort of downward spiral going into that old brain, that emotional brain, and not being able to access that higher brain, which is what we use, which is what we're paid to use at work. So that's one example that really stands out to me in terms of how it can make a difference in teams.
Dan, you also repeatedly mentioned that being self-aware of your triggers is extremely important for leaders to be able to feel the sense of psychological safety and hence make decisions accordingly. But you also admitted that this is a high order skills and not everybody is capable of doing so. So when you train leaders, are there any tips that you give them out to apply this in real life to be able to create that sense of self-awareness of their triggers? Something that our listeners can probably do in their day-to-day life as well?
Yes. The first step we use is an understanding of what these triggers are and what they mean. So, we have an assessment. You can go on and take it for free. It'll give you to quantify which one of these between those 5 I mentioned: security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, and trust. Which one it quantifies on a scale of 0 to 10 based on this validated tool. Which one is most important for your brain? Okay, and let's say it's security. And security is the biggest need that my brain has to feel psychologically safe. Now I know that. Now I can approach situations where I know there's going to be a lack of security. So a lack of details, maybe things are changing quickly. I can approach it cautiously. I can tell myself, all right, this is going to be difficult for me. Here's what I have to do. So I can put a plan in place. One of the ways we do that with people, a very simple data-driven way to do this, is a lot of research around this technique called labeling. Okay, I don't know if you're familiar with labeling, but it speaks towards what we're talking about in terms of the emotional brain versus that logical, rational brain. When we are in that threat state, let's say my brain really needs security, really needs details, and I'm not getting it, and people are just glossing over everything and moving on and changing. That's stressful for me. So I'm going to go into my emotional brain, and I may become angry. I may become frustrated. Labeling is a technique where you simply name your emotion, okay? And it's not getting into the emotion or really ruminating on it. It's simply naming it. And when you do that, what your brain is doing is it's sort of short-circuiting that emotional component. So if I'm feeling frustrated and angry, and I can feel that welling up in my body, if I take a step back and say, okay, what am I feeling now? I'm feeling frustration. I'm feeling like I'm not being heard, and I'm feeling like things are moving too fast. I'm labeling that. What I'm doing is getting out of that emotional brain, and I'm going into the higher brain, because in order to label an emotion, to put a name to it, I need to go into the language center of my brain. That's higher brain. Just by doing that, it takes a split second. I can short circuit that response. So I'm not going from A to B really quickly. I can take a pause, and that simple act of labeling, it sounds simple, but it can actually change the way your brain is managing its energy, so you're not reacting and going down that downward spiral of emotions.
That reminds me of this beautiful tool that exists, which is Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions, where
Yes.
where he has those 8 primary emotions: joy, disgust, fear, and then there are other peripheral emotions. And that's a beautiful way of labeling what you're going through. It's such an interesting topic, and especially psychological safety. We may need one more separate podcast for it. The next question, obvious question that Rad we have is, where do you really see this neuro leadership going in future? Do you think it will become a very important and a standard part of leadership development? Because as we see it is still picking up. So where
Yeah.
do you see the future of neuro leadership?
I think it's actually becoming mainstream. I'm surprised at how many people are familiar with this idea of a brain-based leadership approach. And one of the reasons I think this is happening is because there's ISO guidances now for psychosocial risk. Psychosocial hazards is what it's called. So again, you have these ISO guidances for physical safety and environmental safety. So there have been guidelines released, and these are mandatory in Australia, Canada, and some European countries, where organizations are required to manage what they're calling psychosocial risks, psychological safety risks. In other words, if you're an organization, you are required, just like you would for physical safety, to ensure psychological safety in your employees. And that means coming up with a way to train on it, coming up with a way to measure it, and coming up with a way to ensure that it stays alive. That you are managing people's psychological safety. This ISO guidance came out a few years ago, and recently it came to the sort of forefront of the news when there was a case in Australia of an organization that was fined $500,000 for ignoring this, for neglecting to ensure this. There was an employee at this organization in Australia who felt like they were being bullied at work, and who felt that they really didn't have any control of what they were doing. They were being micromanaged, all these types of things we talk about. They became despondent and committed suicide. This is serious. This is real world. And so with the mental health crisis, my other life is working in biotech and mental health therapies. And I can tell you, you mentioned the pandemic earlier. Since the pandemic, we have had an increase in depression and anxiety across the globe, like we've never seen before. This is most pronounced in teenagers. But when we look at the data from some of the recent large Gallup polls, what we're finding is there's an incredible amount of people. In fact, with their last research, I believe it was around 30% of employees felt that they reported feeling significant stress in the past 24 hours at work. That's a lot. That's a big deal. I think so now organizations are starting to figure out there's a couple reasons to pay attention to this. One is for the benefit, the mental health of our employees. But from a business perspective, it makes sense to ensure that your people are using that higher brain, that their mental health, their cognitive health are stable, and they're maximizing their performance based on this.
Thank you so much, Dan. Before we close on to this podcast, I have one final question for our listeners. If they could remember just one brain-based leadership habit to become better decision makers, what should that be?
Really, where the field's going with all of this is building a resilient brain. Okay, what I mean by that is we're finding out our brain is so good at not just healing itself, but wiring itself to deal with stressors. It's amazing when you study this, how well adept our brain is at doing that. And so the whole field is going towards building up those networks in your brain that allow you to deal with all of this, right? Stress, trauma, emotional regulation. So on the surface, I would say the research, there's a tremendous amount of research around the benefit of mindfulness training for building a resilient brain. It's another thing that's become mainstream. You have Harvard Medical doing mindfulness training with their residents who are working 80 to 100 hours a week. All right. It's at that level where it's accepted scientifically. So to me, in terms of just a behavioral intervention, mindfulness training is one where there's a tremendous amount of research to building a resilient brain, so that it's not a good strategy to say, I'm not going to be stressed. I'm going to avoid stress. We can't do that. So knowing that, I use the analogy of doing this, building a resilient brain is sort of like having a vaccine for a virus. You take it prophylactically so that when you do encounter the virus, it's not going to have as bad of effect. And that's what we see with building a resilient brain. So mindfulness can do that. We're seeing some pretty amazing biochemical changes when you practice mindfulness. It's the true mind-body connection. We see when you do mindfulness training and you become adept at it, you're actually increasing the chemicals in your brain that allow you to counter what stress does to your brain. Right, so we can see that at a biochemical level. The other thing that we're finding of late in the neuroscience field for building resilience and keeping your brain healthy is intermittent fasting. There's a real interesting story around the neuroscience of intermittent fasting. Most people, when they talk about fasting, they think, oh, weight loss or that type of thing.
Yeah.
There's a direct benefit on your brain and your brain's ability to heal itself with intermittent fasting. It's a pretty fascinating story. So those are the two things when I think about the research that really stand out as, I don't want to say no-brainers, but techniques that really can help us to build that resilient brain. And then once you have that resilient brain, it opens up a whole new world in terms of being able to stop your emotional outbursts, being able to take other people's perspectives and manage your biases. That's a big one.
Dan, you just motivated me and Saiba to go on intermittent fasting. Well, there are so many learnings we had. I like, the fact that psychological safety is so important, and how beautifully you've summarized that. I never knew that the brain is healing on its own. The brain is becoming, its own medicine. So thank you so much for sharing that. But above all, yes, the fact that leadership starts in the mind. The better you know your own brain, the stronger you lead.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Dan, for joining us today. And thank you so much, our viewers and listeners. And we hope we'll bring another beautiful speaker next time to decode another facet of human behavior. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you, Saiba.